I loved Sansa as I loved her mother. 4 seconds later, Petyr Baelish is against a wall, with a hand around his throat, staring into the eyes of a man who has just promised to kill him. Watch that moment back, not the choke, the half-second before it. Littlefinger's face doesn't show anger. It doesn't show defiance. It shows something we almost never see on this character in 8 seasons of the show. Genuine, unrehearsed fear. That's the mystery we're solving today. Not, did Jon overreact? And not, was Littlefinger lying? The real question is simpler and much scarier for Petyr Baelish. Why did the single most dangerous manipulator in Westeros walk down a staircase into the crypts of Winterfell and walk back out having lost control of the room for the first time in his adult life? Let's go down there with him, the man who always knows what you want. Before we get to Jon, we need to understand the engine that has powered every one of Littlefinger's victories up to this point. Petyr Baelish doesn't win through strength, and he doesn't win through information alone. He wins because he is, without exception, the fastest person in any room at identifying exactly what another human being wants, and then positioning himself as the only route to get it. Catelyn Stark wanted to feel chosen over her husband's memory of a dead sister. Lysa Arryn wanted to feel desired instead of discarded. Sansa wanted safety and a father figure. Cersei wanted validation that her paranoia was justified. The Iron Throne itself, in Littlefinger's own words, is just a ladder, and every person on it is climbing toward some appetite he can see and exploit. This is why he's spent his entire life indoors, metaphorically speaking. Brothels, small councils, sept gardens, whispered corridors. These are places built entirely out of desire. Everyone in King's Landing wants something, and wanting something is a leash. Littlefinger has never lost a negotiation with a person who wanted something. So when he follows the newly crowned king in the north, down into a freezing stone crypt, he isn't improvising. He's running the exact same play he's run 100 times. Identify the appetite, attach himself to it, collect the debt later. The problem is that this play requires an appetite, and Jon Snow doesn't have one Littlefinger can find. The first wrong move, trying to buy grief. Littlefinger opens with Ned Stark's bones, reminding Jon that he personally delivered them home. On paper, this is smart. Grief is usually one of the most reliable appetites a manipulator can attach to, because a grieving person is starving for anyone who seems to have cared about the deceased. Offer them that feeling, and they'll often hand you their trust just to keep the feeling going. But notice what Jon does. He doesn't soften. He doesn't thank him. He barely acknowledges the sentence was spoken. Littlefinger has just handed over what should be a winning card, and the man across from him hasn't even looked down to see it. That's the first crack. Littlefinger has never had to deal with someone who simply refuses to cash a check that's being handed to him for free. The second wrong move, the wound that wouldn't open. When sentiment doesn't land, Littlefinger pivots to something colder and more precise. Jon's bastardy, and Catelyn's well-known dislike of him. She wasn't fond of you, was she? Followed instantly by the flattering twist. She underestimated you. This is the oldest trick in his book. Open a childhood wound, then be the one who bandages it. It's how he got his hooks into half of Westeros's nobility. Remind someone of the room they were never fully welcome in, then offer to be the one person who always saw their worth. It doesn't work either. And here's what should have terrified Littlefinger in this exact moment, if he'd been paying attention. Jon's silence isn't the silence of a wound being reopened. It's the silence of a man who settled that question about himself a long time ago and has no interest in relitigating it with a stranger. Littlefinger is trying to pick a lock on a door that was never closed to begin with. The third wrong move, selling the debt. By this point, Littlefinger has tried sentiment and he's tried insecurity. Both have failed to produce so much as a flicker. So he does what every cornered manipulator eventually does. He stops trying to create a bond and starts trying to enforce one that supposedly already exists. If it weren't for me, you'd have been slaughtered on that battlefield. This is Littlefinger, reaching for the single most dependable lever in his entire toolkit, obligation. He didn't save Jon out of loyalty. He saved him because an alive, indebted king in the north is worth infinitely more to Littlefinger than a dead one. And in any other conversation, with any other man, this line would work. Obligation is heavy. Most people carry it without even noticing the weight. Jon carries nothing. He simply looks at him. 3 appetites tried. 3 appetites that don't exist. This is the moment the entire architecture of Littlefinger's confidence should have started to wobble, because for the first time in the story, he is standing in front of a person he cannot map. The line that breaks the room. And this is where Littlefinger, out of options and visibly losing ground, makes the mistake that will define the rest of his story. I loved Sansa as I loved her mother. In Littlefinger's mind, this is a diplomatic offering, proof of long-term goodwill, a promise wrapped in nostalgia. He thinks he's finally found the lever. Jon cares about his sister, so Littlefinger will position himself as her guardian, and therefore, as someone Jon needs to keep close. But he has badly misjudged his audience one final time. Jon isn't a court noble trained to hear coded diplomatic language. He hears exactly what was said, in the plainest possible terms. A grown man just told him he has feelings for his teenage sister that mirror the feelings he once had for her mother. The response is immediate and physical. No negotiation, no clever comeback, just a hand on the throat and 6 words that aren't a threat so much as a fact. Talk to my sister, and Littlefinger dies. Watch Littlefinger's face in that half-second before the wall hits his back. That's not the look of a man recalculating his next move. That's the look of a man realizing, for the first time in his adult life, that he has completely lost the ability to predict what happens next in a conversation he started. Why losing isn't what actually scared him. Here's the part most breakdowns of this scene get slightly wrong. It's tempting to say Littlefinger was simply outmatched, that Jon is younger, stronger, and armed, and of course a smaller, older man would be afraid of that. But that reading undersells what's actually happening. Littlefinger has been in physical danger before. He's had knives at his throat, armies against his walls, executioners a sentence away. Fear of violence alone has never derailed him. He talked his way out of Ned Stark's blade with a smile still on his face. What derails him in this crypt isn't the threat of violence. It's the silence that surrounds it. Every previous opponent gave Littlefinger something to work with. Anger he could redirect. Pride he could flatter. Fear he could soothe. Jon gives him nothing before the choke and nothing after it. He doesn't gloat, he doesn't threaten further. He releases him, turns around and simply leaves Littlefinger standing alone in the dark, with no data at all about what just happened or what comes next. For a man whose entire identity is built on always knowing the next move, his own and everyone else's, that void is the single most frightening thing in the 7 Kingdoms. Littlefinger isn't afraid of Jon Snow's strength. He's afraid of Jon Snow's unreadability. He has just met the first person in the entire story who cannot be modeled, priced, or predicted, and it shakes him more than any blade ever could. The detail, even the show leaves out. There's a small, cruel irony buried underneath this scene that the show never quite spells out. Littlefinger opens the entire conversation by reminding Jon that he personally carried Ned Stark's bones home, implying a debt owed for that gesture of decency. In George R.R. Martin's novels, that gesture never actually happens the way the show tells it. Catelyn hands Ned's bones over to the Silent Sisters to be carried north, but Ironborn forces seize Moat Cailin and cut off the route entirely. The bones never make it home. They're left behind in the chaos of a war that Littlefinger himself set in motion. So even the one card Littlefinger opens with, in the deeper lore of the story he helped author, was never really his to play. He starts the conversation by asking to be thanked for a kindness that, in the wider mythology of these events, he arguably prevented from ever being completed. The real lesson from the crypt: strip away the swords and the crowns, and this scene is a case study anyone can recognize. People who operate through manipulation build their entire confidence around one skill: reading what others want and quietly attaching a price tag to it. It works over and over because almost everyone wants something they're willing to bend for. But that entire strategy has exactly one blind spot, and it's a big one. It collapses completely the moment it meets someone who genuinely doesn't want anything from them. Not power, not approval, not comfort, not even revenge. Littlefinger walked into that crypt, expecting to find another appetite to attach himself to. Instead, he found a wall with no door in it, and that absence terrified him more than any threat ever could. Jon Snow never had to out-scheme Littlefinger. He just had to be a person Littlefinger's playbook had no page for. So, was that fear justified? Was Littlefinger right to be terrified of a man who wanted nothing from him, or did he simply misread a threat that was never really there? Let me know your read in the comments. See you in the next one.